George Washington, first President of the United States. 2 terms of office between 1789 and 1797. No political party. Known as the father of our country. Born February 22, 1732, in Virginia. Died at age 67, December 14, 1799, in Virginia. George Washington was well known to the people in the brand new United States of America. The public knew about his military service during the war, just like future Presidents Ulysses S. Grant and Dwight Eisenhower. But as our nation's very first president, George Washington molded the position as if it were from lumps of clay. When George was born in 1732, there were no United States. The land was made up of colonies and territories, under the individual control of England, France, and Spain. Along the East Coast, Britain had colonies like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and others. Little is known about George Washington as a boy, but a few things are certain. An often told story says that he once threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River. Not possible. The river averages more than 1,300 feet across, so it's just not true. A bigger tale says he chopped down a cherry tree on his family's land and, being truthful, admitted the bad deed to his father. Never happened, but it was a myth created in an early biography about George. Both stories illustrate just how eager America was to make him a larger-than-life figure. As a teen, he began to survey in the Virginia Territory, measuring and mapping much of the land. In 1748, at 16 years of age, Washington became an officer in the Virginia militia. He fought in what would develop into the French and Indian War. In spite of some tough experiences, George survived and returned to his plantation of Mount Vernon in 1759. He married Martha Custis and farmed tobacco and wheat. Washington began milling flour and distilling whiskey, becoming a successful plantation owner. During that time, he also served in the Virginia government. Like most colonists, George didn't care for the way England taxed and treated them. As a delegate to the Second Congressional Congress in 1775, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The American Revolution had just begun, and the soldiers were badly trained and poorly equipped. It was now up to George to get them ready to fight. General Washington shrewdly led his soldiers across the Delaware River on Christmas night of 1776. They quickly captured a group of German fighters, hired by the British government, in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington and his soldiers repeated that success a few days later in Princeton, New Jersey. But Washington's troops lost some battles in the New York Territory. Tired and hungry, the army camped during a bitter winter at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia. Thousands of soldiers died from disease and starvation. George struggled to keep up the spirits of his troops, and they did make it through to the spring. France became an ally of the colonists. With those additional troops, Washington was able to defeat the British, including a decisive win at Yorktown, Virginia. England agreed to peace, signing the Treaty of Paris in 1783. America would finally be its own boss. Washington left the military and public service, wanting to give back to his family, farm, and businesses at Mount Vernon. But George was concerned that the country for which he'd fought so hard was not going in the right direction. In 1787, he arrived in Philadelphia, where he was chosen to oversee the convention that would create the U.S. Constitution. After that, Washington urged that it be approved, which it was in 1788. 11 of the 13 new states quickly accepted the new Constitution. Rhode Island and North Carolina agreed in 1790. An important part of the Constitution, Article 2, called for the election of a president. He would be the leader of the country, the head of the executive branch in government, the commander-in-chief of the military, the head of state in foreign matters. It was made clear that the President of the United States would be the most powerful figure in this new country. Each state would choose representatives, a group called the Electoral College, who would elect this president for a term of 4 years. Even though there was no campaigning or political parties in 1789, George Washington was elected by every member of the Electoral College. He was re-elected in 1793, and those were the only 2 times in U.S. history where that happened. Even so, the president was not all-powerful. That was one of the things the colonists had disliked about the King of England and other countries around the world. The U.S. president would work with Congress, as well as the courts, to make the country a success. All 3 branches of the government, executive, legislative, and judicial, would balance each other. Washington was sworn in as president, called an inauguration, at Federal Hall in New York City.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Soon after, political parties started to form in the nation, each with different ideas on how the United States should be run. Federalists favored a strong national government and big business. On the other hand, Democratic Republicans were popular with farmers and wanted a weaker national government. Washington worked hard to stay above these growing political parties, believing the president should represent everyone equally. Washington visited the states during his first term, curious about just what the people of the nation wanted from their government. And though he wished to retire to Mount Vernon after 1 term, his friends convinced him to take on a 2nd term in 1793. During his next 4 years in office, George focused on foreign affairs. The French Revolution removed King Louis XVI from the throne. Washington believed the U.S. should stay out of the fight. Our young country needed to concentrate on our own growth. America started setting a tax on American liquor distillers in 1791. By 1794, those being taxed were very unhappy about it, especially those in western Pennsylvania. They responded with riots known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington sent more than 13,000 militia troops to settle things down, and they did, with no one getting hurt. Under George's 2nd term, Spain agreed to let America use the Mississippi River to move goods for business. It also gave explorers access to the West for further expansion. The Jay Treaty was also signed, which settled some matters that remained between the U.S. and Great Britain after the American Revolution. In September of 1796, George made his farewell address as he retired from public office and returned to Mount Vernon. He spent several years with his wife Martha until he passed away in 1799. The nation felt a monument to Washington was fitting. He was a leader in the American Revolution as well as being the country's first president. By 1848, a design was chosen and construction started. It would be a thin building called an obelisk, almost 600 feet tall, set amid a circle of columns more than 250 feet across. But funding was hard to come by. Work stopped in 1854, and the circle of columns was taken out of the design. The Civil War kept the project on hold until 1880, more than 30 years since it had started. When construction resumed, brand new marble stone was used. As a result, the shaft is actually 2 different colors. Opened to the public in 1888, the Washington Monument was 555 feet tall. At that time, it was the tallest structure in the world and a very proper tribute to one of America's first heroes. More, Washington appears on the $1 bill and quarter coin. There are nearly 100 places in the United States named for the nation's first president. As a recap, George Washington was America's first president. He served 2 terms between 1789 and 1797. Before that, he was a land surveyor and plantation owner. Washington also earned the country's respect as a general in the American Revolution. As president, he developed relationships with countries in Europe. George also directed the growth of the new United States of America.